Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. Let me see. We have with us Anne Goldstein. She's an editor at The New Yorker. In addition to bringing Elena Ferrante's work to English-speaking audiences, she's also translated Pier Paolo Pasolini and Alessandro Baricco, and is the editor of the complete works of Primo, Levi in English. We have Roxana Robinson, who is the author most recently of the novel Sparta, along with 4 other novels, 3 short story collections, and a biography of Georgia O'Keeffe, and Judith Thurman, a staff writer at The New Yorker, and the author of 2 books, including Isaac Dinesen, The Life of a Storyteller. So welcome you all. Welcome you all. So let's just set the stage a little bit in terms of where each of you, how you entered into the world of Ferrante. Anne.
I was brought in by the publisher, who was when Sandro Ferri, who's here, decided to start a publishing company in English, I should say, and in America. The first book that he decided to publish was Ferrante's The Days of Abandonment, and they were looking for a translator, and a few people tried out, and I won this little contest. I shouldn't say won. I should say they chose me. So that's how I found out about Ferrante. I didn't know about her before that.
And when was this?
2004, I think. Something. Yeah, 5.
Roxana?
I was just looking. I write inside books that I own. I write inside the cover where and when I read them. And I first read the first novel in the Neapolitan series in 2013 in Brittany. And I was flying over to Europe to go on a garden tour. It was in Normandy, actually. And my horrible Air France announced 2 days before that I was not going to fly directly from New York to Paris. I was going to fly to London, where I was going to have a 5-hour layover starting at 2 o'clock in the morning. And then I was going to fly to Paris. And I was so angry at Air France. And they said, no, you'll have fun. You can have a cup of coffee and you can have a good time. This is what you want to do at 2 in the morning. Anyway, so I was in Heathrow in the bookstore looking for stuff and grinding my teeth. And I was looking for books because I like to buy books when I'm on the trip where I am. And I was buying American books and English books. And I thought, actually, I'm going to Europe. I should buy something that's European. And I saw this book, and I remembered that I'd seen James Wood had written something about it. So I bought it. I could hardly leave my room during the whole garden tour. I didn't want to see any gardens. I didn't want to go outside. I was desperate to get all the other books right then in my hotel room. It was simply overwhelming. I was just swept away. So that's me.
That's a good one.
I have a similar story. I had heard about Ferrante, I think probably from Anne, among other people. And I was in India for a month with my son. And I was terribly jet lagged, so I was waking up at 4 in the morning and reading for 3 or 4 hours. And I ran out of things to read, and I went to the bookstore in Delhi, in the Khan Market, and there on the table was My Brilliant Friend. So I did the same thing. I barely saw India. I was obliged to leave Delhi and go to other places. But I read my way through 3 Ferrante books. You have to connect through Delhi to go to other places, and I went back to the bookstore, and I got the next volumes. And then I gave them to one of my traveling companions as I finished them, and which was a real act of generosity because I wanted to keep them and I wanted to own them. And then, so I read my way through the what was then a trilogy, and last summer I was invited to Le Conversazioni, a literary festival in Capri, and I did my little Ferrante pilgrimage of Naples by myself at 100 degrees. I walked to every place in the books, and it was an exceptional experience.
So, like being part of anything that sort of starts kind of modestly but very, beautifully, and then becomes a phenomenon, Hamilton comes to mind, or something that is like turns into something you could not possibly have anticipated. When you first entered those worlds, those novels, did you have a sense of what these books would mean or come to mean? These stories, this writing, this woman.
No, I didn't, because I was reading them also. I was reading them one novel at a time. I was working on the first novel before any of the others had been written. So I really had no sense of the scope. I mean, I had a sense of the scope because she sort of sets it up with a sense of the scope, but I had no idea what the details were going to be.
And what did it
in any
feel like
sense.
to be in that first book?
What did it? It was amazing. I mean, as we all know, it was. Well, it was as if I was going back with her to live my childhood. I mean, of course, not actually my childhood, but the idea of someone going back and reconstructing her childhood was very appealing to me, and I was really drawn into it and fascinated by it. I mean, and maybe in some ways the details of childhood are more universal than the details of when the girls grow up, of school and friendship. I don't know, but anyway, it was very completely compelling.
A lot of people talk about the universality of the friendships, as you said, and you just have now said that it maybe is the childhood. Can you, Roxanne? Yes. Talk about how that might be like. What are the universality points for you in the work?
I think that we're talking about a large issue. The way novels change our lives and change us is not by making us feel that we are Neapolitan. We know we aren't, but it allows us to live as a Neapolitan. So what Ferrante does for me is to address these issues with such complete honesty. She's so honest about everything that happens to these two girls. And there's such velocity. She never lingers and says, and this is how I felt. It's bam, bam. We went up the stairs to the ogre. He was made half of metal. Leela wouldn't look at me. She's ahead of me. I mean, the whole thing is just so rapid, and you're breathless. So that sense, I guess if we're talking about universality, it's the sense of human experience that she makes every moment into one that you could have lived.
That's a beautiful answer. Judith, do you have anything on that about universality?
Well, actually, I read Troubling Love when I was doing my little pilgrimage. I read it in Italian, L'amore molesto, and then I read it in English. And for me, it's the level of the language, the feeling of connection to Ferrante and through the language to this primal woman's experience was something I felt I had been waiting for my whole life as a writer and as a reader. She was speaking to me from a place that no other writer actually had ever spoken to. It infuriates me when people speculate that she's a man. That is simply impossible. And men can imagine women and have done so brilliantly, but this is written from the inside in such a way which is both sure and reckless, and all of so the issues of abandonment, which I think are pretty universal for women, of separation, of attachment and separation, in Frantumaglia she says. The feminine, you have to learn to love your mother as women do. She says it better than that. Again, the primal issues of being a woman are really embodied in the sentences, in both languages, in Anne's translation as well.
It is so interesting, embodied in the sentences. So we talked a little bit in the green room about this notion of it being, her anonymity is, and people speculating that it might be a man who wrote it. And I don't understand where that could have started. I understand why it could have started for, all of the obvious reasons. But you had some insight as to how the Italians are reading her and responding to her.
Well, I mean, if there are Italians in the audience, you probably love Ferrante, so you're excused from the tirade you're about to hear. But but I have many Italian friends, and I've spent a lot of time there. And the Italians are sort of stunned and sort of outraged that we in America, we in the English language reading world, have embraced her in a way that they never did or have not yet done. And there's this sort of, the focus seems to be on outing her and rather than on reading her, which infuriates me. Look, if you can imagine Philip Roth's Sabbath's Theater having been written by a woman, then I will entertain the thought that Ferrante was written by a man. But honestly, no.
The other thing I wonder, this idea of empowerment, or her anonymity being a kind of empowerment. We love to throw that word around in America and in this culture, from Beyonce to Oprah to whatever. Really, it's like she's so empowered. But do you think that she would even begin to imagine her anonymity and as a kind of empowerment?
I don't think so. I think it's sort of the opposite in a way. I mean, whatever the opposite is exactly. But no, I mean, she said that she's separating from her books once they're written, that they don't need her anymore. They let them make their way in the world. And I don't think that's empowering the author I mean, maybe there's some broader sense in which that's empowering. I don't know.
And that's a really interesting concept too, of the books being out there and then them not needing you anymore. As a writer, Roxana, do you feel that way about your books and your work?
Yeah, that was another thing. In those interviews, there's so many moments where I thought, yes, that's exactly how it feels. So you do, when you're writing a book, you're very much caught up in it. You live in that world. And then when it's done, you're no longer in that world, and you give it up, and it has its own existence.
Do you think that is specific to fiction, to novels? Because as an author of nonfiction books, I feel like I continue to have a relationship with those books.
Well, I've only written one nonfiction, the biography of Georgia O'Keeffe, and I certainly loved living in that world when I did, and there are moments when I do an interview or something and I'm called back into it and I like it, but I don't live there anymore. It's a place I used to live.
Judith?
Well, I'm a biographer and primarily, and so I spent 7 years on one book and 8 years on another. It's a very long chunk of one's life. And at the end, it feels like a very good divorce. You stay friends, but you are going to another place.
Yeah.
You're moving on, and you have to in some strange way.
And do you revisit the work to read?
They're part of you, just the way it's a very deep relationship. They are part of your life. You know them better than you know their lives better than your own. I mean, I don't know where I was last week at 7:30, but I could tell you where Colette was or where Denison was on the 28th of April. Actually, probably could. So it's so much attention has been paid in a way that I think you pay more attention to your subjects. I pay more attention to my subjects, even as a journalist, than I do to my own life.
Wow. And the translation aspect of it is fascinating to me, because as I said in the green room, of all the languages, I mean, English, not so beautiful. I mean, it's all right, and it has its moments, and some of us do good things with it. But I mean, Italian and for the Romance languages and so on and so forth, there's just it's a different tenor and fluidity. And so what is it like to be in that language and then change it to this language?
Well, I think that you're as the translator, in a way, you're in the middle of both languages all the time. I mean, you're sort of all the time going back and forth. So you're not, I mean, in some ways, sometimes I think I'm not in it enough. Or I'm not in the other one enough. I like to read, when I'm translating, I often like to read a book in English, have some great writer that I'm reading in English in order not to lose the sense of English while I'm working. But it's kind of a hard world in some ways, but it's completely fascinating because you're constantly trying to make something fit into something that it wasn't meant for necessarily.
I was just curious, which of the books was the hardest for you?
Well, in some ways, the last one, I think, was the hardest because it's more complicated. It's more bad things happen. There's the whole section about the history of Naples, which is very complicated and difficult. That was hard. I mean, just in terms of a job.
Can you remember any of the books, the great books American or English written books when you were translating?
Well, I like, two of my favorites are P.G. Wodehouse and Henry James.
When you, Roxana, when you read these books, how often do you think of how they might read in Italian?
I don't speak Italian. I French and Spanish are the languages that I know better. So there's certainly, it certainly feels as though it's been written in another language, but I don't know Italian well enough to enter into that. I don't live there.
Yeah, I find myself sort of, that I'm sorry that I didn't bring my copies with me, but I had underlined various passages and thinking, what would that sound like in Italian? And I don't know how, when you're translating, you're literally translating, or you're thinking, this is sort of what it would sound like. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's like, is it actually these words in Italian?
Well, sometimes. I hope more or less it's these words.
Well, I can speak to this because I read
Judith,
Italian, and I've
she's
read
both in both versions.
it's a brilliant translation. That's sort of, people have said, and that Anne has translated the books up. That's what you hear. People say this, and there is a very good argument for that. In fact, you could also say that it's just it's innately different. There's a sort of crystalline quality that the English has that the very, very viscous Italian doesn't have, or is just different from. I don't know. It's it's the same book, and I read the Italian through a slight scrim. I'm reading it and I'm understanding it, but when I read the English, the scrim is taken away, and I see the beauty of the sentences and of how it all hangs together with much greater clarity, because my Italian's good, but it's not like Anne's. So they're very respectful translations, but they're also they have the necessary independence.
One of the things that interested me, since I don't speak the language, I wasn't thinking about that, but I was fascinated by the use of the dialect. And I, in fact, have asked Anne about this. I would love to hear the dialect. I would love to, because she uses it's such a powerful presence in these books, and it means a great deal. People lapse into dialect for certain things. The narrator lapses for certain things. She uses Italian for certain things. So you have the feeling that they are very different parts of the mind, parts of the consciousness.
But she doesn't. She does. There's no dialect in the book. She says in Italian they speak dialect. She doesn't. Right. She doesn't write the dialect.
Yeah, but I would love to hear what they are. I mean,
what you're not even hearing in Italian.
Yeah, I would love to know. The difference, because she makes it clear that there's a huge difference in what they're saying and how it sounds. So I don't think we have the equivalent in English. No. It's not like slang or a regional accent.
No,
it's almost not. It's a small language and it's of its own.
Can you speak to that a little bit? What?
I can't. Oh, I thought you were saying, can I speak? No, I can't speak the dialect.
Can you speak the dialect?
But I just read this. I was just looking at the Frantumaglia, and she says. Or actually, it was just I guess it was an interview in which she says, in which Ferrante says that that she didn't want to write in dialect because she thinks of it as a kind of threatening language, and she wanted to have the threat of that language in her Italian, but she didn't want to actually use that language.
The threat,
because it's the language of. Certainly the language of violence. It's also the language of children. It's the language of home. I mean, those are most of the situations in which dialect is used.
It's the language of poverty.
That too, yeah.
So, I mean, I think we do have that in some places. I mean, one of the things that really struck me is of course, the class issues and the education and what separates them fundamentally, right? And so I grew up in a very small rural New Hampshire town, and I went to a regional high school where that included very rich, wealthy towns. And this high school was literally split between the front hall and the back hall. The back hall was, the the Solaros, and the front hall was the white wealthy kids who were all by junior year looking at Ivy League schools. And I allied myself with the front hall because I saw it as a vehicle, as a way out of this small rural town that was also entirely white. And so I am interested in the power that then gives, and whether or not there remains power. And you're talking about it as like a threat, a language of threat, and threat to me somehow seems to wield power.
Well, I think that she meant it not just literally as a threatening language. I think all the things that you just said, I think is how, in some sense, is what she means. That it's the language of the back hall, what you call the back hall, in a way. I mean, it's the language that's going to hold you back. That's the language of the place that you want to get away from, and it's threatening in that sense too. The thing that's going to keep you where you are when you want to,
right?
Get away.
And how does that then define you and define your quality of life and existence, right? So the people, the front hall people, I saw, I'm going to go to college, I'm going to get an education, and I'm going to move to New York City, and I'm going to do what I'm going to do. The folks who are in the back hall are largely still in the back hall in that small town where I came from. But does that make Lila or Lenu, who's better? Whose lives are better, right? I mean, that's a very interesting question to me. Judith, I see you.
Well, no, I'm just thinking. I'm thinking about Lila's perversity. I mean, she's a character of fabulous perversity. She could leave. She's absolutely brilliant. I mean, that the pun on the brilliant friend is who is the brilliant friend, and she. It's sort of like the great Buñuel film Exterminating Angel. She can't leave.
Go in a little bit more on that, because she can leave. You say she can leave because she's brilliant. So is that
she's brilliant? She can speak Italian. She has this great mathematical gift. She's a chameleon in some ways. She refuses, just like she throws the book into the fire, and there's a threshold of perversity that Lila won't cross in her own life, it seems to me. And that's one of the sources of great tension in the friendship between the two of them.
But so she was sort of born brilliant.
Oh, she's completely born brilliant. Elena just marvels at her constantly.
But so the other folks who are not, is that just tough luck for them? You're saying in some ways that her brilliance she could use to get out. She could choose.
Right. The other people are stuck there by their limited horizons. She's a great reader. She's incredibly curious. She's has extraordinary ambition. The ambition is channeled into, first the shoe store and then this. But as the books progress, you can see this ambition. When she becomes a mother, it's focused on taking care of her children too. But she could leave. Yes, it's hard to get out of there. You need something. You need a mentor. You need good grades on the high school exam. You're not going to be pried out of there otherwise.
I'll give an alternate reading. I just, in preparation for this, I just went back and reread My Brilliant Friend, and I was reminded, as I say, that the velocity of the book is extraordinary, but what happens in that first book, and I wasn't really paying attention when I first read it, is the way violence and the abuse of the woman's body controls that book. It's everywhere. And one of the things that I find most interesting in Ferrante is the way she aligns the questions of the family unit and crime, and how the family unit, the most basic form of human existence, is contaminated and destroyed by the criminal presence. And the Solaras, I don't think they think of themselves as backroom people. They are the lords of that community. And when when Lila has her wedding, the Solaras make money off everybody in the room, and they talk about that. But it's violence that prevents Leila from doing anything, and she's helpless. She's a child. Her father will not let her go to school, and he will beat her mother, and he will beat her. He threw her out the window. There are things women can't do, no matter how brilliant they are. They have the body that can be destroyed, can be broken. And when she is married and she makes her husband promise, you may not remember this, you've read it so long ago, but she made her husband promise that the Solara boys would not be at her wedding. He says, "How can I promise that?" She says, "You promise." And he waits until after the ceremony, and then they come in and show her that her husband has betrayed her. And then he beats her, and he makes it clear that he will kill her on her honeymoon. So her choices are really taken away from her by the presence of her body, her female body. And that's what is the cage in that neighborhood.
And so where and when does she choose her defiant moments? Because she's such a defiant person and so full of character and integrity. And she seems so deeply self-possessed. But in instances where violence is inevitable or may happen, do you feel that those are the only moments, or that she is unable to project or put out her defiance? I mean, I have a hard time reconciling with it in some ways, not because I think she should get beat, but because it feels inconsistent with who she is. She's going to get hit anyway, but it seems like she also has a violence about her as well.
She does, and the moment when she throws the rock at one of the boys, I can't remember who it is, and she
Enzo.
hurts him badly. Who is it?
Enzo.
It's Enzo. So in that moment is the moment in which we trust her, and when she goes up the stairs to Dona Achille, and we think this is a girl whose spirit is utterly brave, and she is courageous, she's reckless, and she will carry our flag. She will be the woman who's indefatigable, and she isn't. Her husband kneels on her arms on her honeymoon, and he hits her face until she realizes he will kill her, and at that point we realize that the girl who threw the stone can only be as brave as the man who's in the room with her. She can't keep him from killing her.
Do you feel that Leila had a similar, I mean, I feel like they were both feminists before that language was available to them, but it manifested in very different ways. Can you speak to that at all, Judith?
Well, I think I agree with Roxana, but I also don't see Leila as a victim. She has this innate power. Yes, she's beaten, she's abused. She claims the power of her desire with Nino. She is the risks of infidelity or death. I mean, certainly, she doesn't care. She tells her husband that it's not his kid. She risks her life defiantly at pretty much every turn. But nevertheless, of course, the violence is horrific. What's so extraordinary about the violence in this book is how casual it is. It's never the way we're talking about it here. It's never done that way in the books. It's just a fact of life.
Right.
And that casualness is one of the most shocking aspects of the books. But this is a saga about Ferrante. This is a saga about the new modern woman. This is really the birth of feminism, and the whole the arc of the books traces it really from the late 40s, the early 50s, the 60s, the false feminism of the early radical period of when women were getting the coffee. And then the sort of burst of feminist energy, and in the 70s, and it's extraordinary. It really charts the experience of women the transformative experience of the women's revolution, such as it has been.
So I think I would say that it is shocking, the violence, the casual violence is shocking if that is not the world that you live in. I mean, I think that in many communities, certainly around the globe, but in America, women live in that kind of casual violence all of the time. So I think that is, it was very real and honest, but it didn't strike me as especially shocking. But what was shocking to me is that these two women, these girls and teenagers and women, had this friendship that incorporated all the things that they were experiencing around them. All of the, in some ways, the violence, the love, the lust, the jealousy, the expectation, the resentment, all of the families that were living and trying to make their lives were sort of imbued in this friendship, and they had to figure it out. And it ends up, I think, that there's a real betrayal of Lanu leaving. When you Anne were translating after the first and then the second, and you're in these women's lives, and how do you feel like their friendship? I know this is a loaded and different, complex question, perhaps, but did you see their childhood reflected in their friendship throughout?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think that first moment where where Leela pushes the doll into the cellar. I mean, that's sort of the pattern. And then there's the next part of the pattern is leading her up the stairs to Don Aquiles' apartment, and where she turns back to hold her hand. I mean, that pattern is repeated, I think, through the books all the way through.
How much do they love each other?
Well, I think they do. I mean, I think they can't help it in a way, because they're so entwined in each other in a way. I mean, they work off each other in a kind of internally. I mean, each one is always reacting. I mean, we don't really know about Leela, but we imagine that she's also reacting to Lanu in the same way that Lanu is always reacting to her, even when she doesn't know she is. So that even when they're not, well, she says that. I mean, even when they don't see each other for a long time, or don't even talk to each other for a long time, they're very aware of each other's presence.
Healthy or not healthy? The relationship, Roxana, do you think, the friendship?
I don't think I would use those words to describe it. I mean, women's friendship, I think, is different from friendship between men. I think it's more complicated. There is jealousy in it, competition, and also a kind of deep engagement. You feel the other person is you, and then if the other person does something that you couldn't do, then you feel resentful. And so there's a strange kind of mirror-like quality. You see yourself in your friend. Is it healthy? I wouldn't say it was unhealthy. I think it's part of life. I think the fact that they were so deeply engaged by each other is kind of splendid. It's what makes these books so powerful and so rich. There's so many layers to their relationship.
Right. I mean, it had me thinking quite a bit about what is friendship. You know, what does it require of you? How do you show up for your friends and your friendship? And what is, you know, and I know I told you I was going to try to make as many parallels to Beyonce's Lemonade tonight as possible. but you know, I mean, this notion of sisterhood and togetherness, and what does it take? How far do you go for your women friends?
But there's also Ferrante's stubborn refusal to idealize anything and anyone.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, we talk about this. This is sort of we can talk about it in a good touchy-feely way, but I think the great thing about these books is that she refuses that. And there's tremendous rage and jealousy and identification and disidentification. And one thing that, when I say it was a revelation of a woman's voice I'd never heard, you're taught as a little girl that your role in life is attunement. That's what you're supposed. Attunement. That's what you're supposed to do. And God help you if you don't. And Leela refuses this, and Lanu gets that, and is looking at Leela as a model for a way to be female, that has, I don't want to use sort of phallic language here, but a way to be female in which you get the violence that you in fact do possess if you will own it. And so the word lost, I mean, if you count the times that Ferrante uses the word lost, there's a lot. So they're looking for something in each other that each of them feels is missing or lost or has been taken away from them. And of course, they don't find it because there's no completion. Completion is an ideal.
I agree that she doesn't idealize, and I think that as a model, it's a very rich and very deep and elegant and gritty and angry and interesting, multi-layered friendship. But can that kind of friendship really sustain? Can it what? Sustain.
Yeah, you don't think so?
I don't know, because I'm still living. You know, I mean,
right. Well, there's that.
I don't know, but I mean, I think that, you know, there's both a gratification and a kind of danger in identifying with a friendship like that, because we live our lives. We have to live our lives, and in some ways, this friendship is insular in a way. You know, they were deeply bonded, but went for periods of time without talking and seeing each other, and probably had to, right? Because otherwise, how would they live their lives in this kind of heated depth and anxiety and sensitivity to each other? I don't know. I mean, in your own friendships, do you look at this friendship and think, oh, okay, I feel much better? That's exactly how I felt.
It's just like mine.
Yeah,
it's exactly like mine.
Well, I think I again, in the attunement department, I think that I wonder about Ferrante herself. You can write about a friendship with this depth of honesty, but do you actually live it? I mean, I'm a certain age, and the friends of my youth, the women friends of my youth, are the most important people to me, apart from my kid. And we don't go there, or we do in a much lighter way. And I wonder if Ferrante goes there with her.
I do too.
Friends.
Yeah, because how can you and live?
But I think that's one of the great things about the way she writes about emotions and relationships, is that she goes to the places that you don't want to go. Right. But it's interesting to see somebody, or interesting or something, or
or terrifying.
To see somebody
powerful.
else do it.
It's powerful to see what's there.
I mean, one of the things about this book is that she raises things to such a level of heightened intensity, so that in some ways the books are intolerably melodramatic, and
right.
you can't imagine anybody living at that level of intensity. So that makes the friendship impossible to sustain, as you say. But in this context, as the core of a book, it's perfect. I mean, it's a enduring relationship, which, as you say, endures despite the fact that they are distant and they are leading different lives. But she is saying there is something here that is so powerful that nothing can break it. And there are also people around being killed. And she starts out in the very beginning saying people were always dying around us. So there's this sense of threat and violence, but also people dying of typhoid, and so there's
children dying, and
so she ups the ante at the very beginning. We're living at a level of intensity which is unreal.
Before we open it up to the audience, I wanted to revisit something that we talked about in the green room and a little bit here, and that is years ago I had a conversation with the poet and novelist Sherman Alexie, who grew up on the reservation, Native American reservation, and left and has gone on to great success. And I, of course, grew up in this small rural town and left to somewhat success. And when we revisit, you know, there's this sense of disconnect, and it's like in Brilliant Friend when Lanu realizes that in order to be around these people, she has to actually suppress a part of who she is. And Sherman and I were talking about, does that make us better people? Does it make us better people that we have gotten an education, that we have traveled, that we have eaten at you know, various places around the world and read books and whatnot? And Sherman believes that it does make him better, and I struggle with that all the time. Do you think that Lenu is a better person for having gotten out of the world, out of that world?
Well, I don't know what you're talking about. Two different things here: better and less provincial. Because I think that I mean I grew up in Queens, and so it was this place was as far away almost as Manhattan, and it was just another world. And I can do Queens dialect really well. I sound just like Fran Drescher. And so when you cultivate yourself, and that's what this is about, you're changed, you're different, you're cultivated, but I don't think you're better, you're just more polished and cultivated. You're deeper, perhaps, you have a deeper understanding of the world, you're certainly more sophisticated, but there's a lot of all kinds of intelligence in provincial places.
But if you have to suppress who you are, or part of who you are, when you go back into the world that you came from, what does that say?
But doesn't she? But in a way, she has to suppress who she is, whichever world she's in. When she goes to the world of the normale, the university, she's suppressing, or of her in-laws. I mean, Lenu is suppressing her.
Yeah,
some part of herself in a way.
I guess my personal bias is that if you have to suppress, you're not being.
That you're not being. Yeah,
who you are.
But what's authentic? Yeah. I mean, I've often asked myself this question because I did come from this little provincial place and talk this way, and I lived in Europe and blah blah blah. I learned languages, all that, and I wondered about this sort of synthesis between the raw and the cooked. And at one point, I realized that it didn't matter. I guess it's age in part. You live with both parts and you feel very inauthentic. You go back and I used to have one of those language accents when I'd lived in Europe for a while. I sounded like the announcer on the late night classical music station. Wolfgang, Amadeus, Mozart. So, but I don't know. The raw and the cooked at some point it's kind of make a meal.
There's a wonderful essay by Zadie Smith. Do you know it about accents?
I do.
She came from a part of London where there was a very marked accent, and she went to Oxford or Cambridge, I think Oxford, and she spoke a different way because she recognized that if she spoke in the accent of her childhood, she would be considered a different kind of person. So she changed her accent to speak like the rest of the students, and she knew who she was, and she knew how she talked with her friends at home, and she knew how she talked at Oxford. And then after a while, when she came home, she found she could no longer speak like the people of her original childhood, and she felt extremely disassociated. So it's a wonderful essay about exactly this issue. But I think we do change as we get older, and only we know who we are, and your intention is to be yourself with whatever group you're with. I mean, one of the things about this neighborhood is, as I say, it's so extreme. Everything in it is so heightened. They are so vengeful. They're so jealous of anybody who has the nerve to step outside the neighborhood to raise themselves socially or financially. Mm-hmm. So there's that risk of threat of, do you think you're better than we are?
Well, that's what I mean, right? So they think that these folks who have left are better. Yeah. And so are they?
Well, they don't think they're better. They think that you're a traitor. They think that they're betrayed, betrayed, not that they're better. That they have given themselves airs, I think. I don't think that they think of the leavers as better. I think they think them as sort of, people who've deserters.
Right. Do we have questions? We have mics set up on both sides here if you want to. Can I just? Yeah. Well, so that other folks can hear.
So, Anne, yes. I want to understand, you're sitting there, you're translating these amazing books. What happens when something really horrible happens in the book? Do you have to stop? Do you want to rewrite it and change and make things better, so that Tina doesn't get lost, so that Nino isn't as horrible as he turns out to be? I mean, well, how do you deal with it?
Well, I have two answers. One is that I get up and walk around the house. The other is that I'm sitting there thinking, don't do that. Don't do that.
Like, do you have to like stop and have a drink and?
No, well, sort of, in some sense. No, those are they're terrible moments, and you go back to them over and over. Having to read them over and over again is sometimes very difficult. The worst one for me is the death of the dog in the days of abandonment. I had to stop. Almost had to stop translating it, or stop revising it, because I couldn't bear to read it another time.
I think the question about the kind of multiplicity of self-states and who you are authentically comes up a lot in translation. I wonder what any of you think about Jhumpa Lahiri writing in Italian now and having these different
well, Anne translated the book. Anne was the translator of that book.
I translated that book into English, which is even more inauthentic, if you want to talk about inauthenticity.
It was very shocking in the New Yorker to read translated from the Italian.
Yeah, well, yes, but it's a whole. I mean, the book itself is in 2 languages. Mm-hmm. I guess you've seen it. Well, that was a strange. I mean, it was a interesting decision on her part, but she felt very strongly that that's what she needed. That's what she needs to do right now, is write in Italian and not translate it herself. Because I think to her, that would have been the most inauthentic thing, or more inauthentic than having somebody else translate it, because she would have been something that she had written in Italian, not translated in her mind from English into Italian, but had written directly in Italian. To then redo it in English would be like rethinking the whole thing, and she didn't want to do that. So I had to rethink it for her. But not as Jhumpa Lahiri. That's, again, it's complicated.
As who? If not
as me, the translator. Oh no, I mean not as Jhumpa Lahiri, the novelist. I mean, I couldn't imagine. I wasn't going to translate it into some kind of English that sounded like Jhumpa Lahiri.
Right.
That's all I meant.
Well, my impression of it, because Anne and Jhumpa were at a panel discussion recently, and it's interesting when you're a writer as gifted as Jhumpa in one language to deprive yourself of that language. And I've been puzzling over this, and I think it's sort of like a vision quest when you go off into the wilderness with no food, and you suffer privations in the name of a vision, in the name of a connection to something. Her Italian is not as good as her English. It's limited. The emotional range is much more limited than the English. But she is on a vision quest for something. And so the intensity comes from this commitment, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Over here?
So in the first book, they talk about, Lenu talks about the possibility that maybe Lila is infiltrating the computer to help her write the novel or to change the way that it's written. And I was wondering if you could speak to that, like if you think it might be happening literally, what you think it might mean metaphorically, and what if it brought up any interesting translation issues for you.
No, not really. I mean, or not that I know about. Unless I think that I think she thinks it. Obviously, it's not literal. I mean, she couldn't. I mean, I think she sees it as a literal, if you can say it's a literal metaphor. That somehow it's part of the whole, the back and forth of who, of identity, and of who's stronger and who's the brilliant friend. I mean, I think it's another metaphor expressing that same dichotomy.
And how do you think your relationship with the work would change if you knew her personally, Ferrante?
I don't know, actually. I mean, maybe I would be more in touch with her. I could ask her, what did you really mean here? I mean, I do ask her through her editors, but I don't know.
But you don't feel like it's been any kind of barrier to the writing?
No, I don't, actually. And maybe even knowing her would be a barrier.
Right.
have to say that final image. Hi, Anne. That final image of Lila in the final book is just, it stayed with me and it really broke me. And there's this, this sense of a haunted woman, neglected, her underwear is showing. What do you think? What do you think of that image, and what do you think Ferrante is trying to say about Lila, about who she is?
We all feel it. This is, as I say, for me, the books are very visceral, and it's about what happens to women. And Lila is brilliant, as Judith said. We feel she could have left. She was prevented from leaving the way Lenu was allowed to. She was not sent to school. She's prevented by the men in her life from following the path that we think she should have followed. We think she should never have married. She should never have gotten into that network of the Camorra. But there are things that are just the image of her when she's working in the sausage factory. There are things that we are forced to look at in terms of someone we admire so much, and we're told over and over how beautiful she is. She's not only brilliant, but she's beautiful. When I was rereading the first book, I kept wishing for a photograph of her. She's so vivid. I would just love to see her walking in those streets. So Ferrante forces us to see the degradation to which someone so powerful and so beautiful is brought. And I think of Dido, that's an image that she wants us to remember over and over, a broken woman.
So again, I want to try to reconcile with why she chose not to leave. You're saying she was prevented, and I believe that, and I understand that, but also she was brilliant, and she was innovative, and she was thoughtful and clever and beautiful. And so it seems to me that's pretty much enough to get out of town.
But then there's the aspect of her saying that she thinks that she needs to stay there and clean up the neighborhood. So that's another aspect of it, of choosing to stay.
Mm-hmm. I mean, for me, that once she got older, I didn't quite believe that she wouldn't leave. So that the third book in particular was less powerful for me than the first and the second, when it felt she really didn't have any options. And then when she got older, I was frustrated, and I wanted to say, just move in with Lenu, because she would let you. You could leave Naples. But in the beginning, she's telling us that she had no options. She gets married at 16. And she's trapped at that point.
Right. I mean, she becomes trapped, and she vocalizes that or talks about it. But she was very pleased at the time. I mean, they hatched this plan that she would, marry Stefano, and she seemed pleased with the money and the attention and the power and the. Did that not give her any? I mean, obviously there were instances where she did not have her agency, but there was some agency there for her in that marriage in the beginning. No?
Well, I thought she was choosing her options. She wasn't allowed to go to school. She was in a place that was completely dominated by this network of criminal presences. They were the people with money. They were the people with power. She chose somebody who she thought, she turned out to be wrong, had separated himself. He was not the Solara family. He was the son of the ogre, but she persuaded herself that he wasn't. He was a different generation, and it wasn't the same thing. So my sense was that she was just choosing the best and most powerful choice that was open to her. But what were her choices? They weren't very much at the age of 16.
Mm-hmm. I also felt, and this is probably a projection, that in some ways she saw herself as a hostage, that she stayed there so that Lenu could leave.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting.
And that's why one of the reasons that she stayed. But somehow, if she had unleashed her power, Lenu would have been diminished.
Certainly, it seems that's how it worked. That one had to be down, and while the other was.
What I didn't understand was why Lenu went back. She's living.
Right.
She's living in the vomitorio. What is it? Vomito.
Vomero.
the vomero, and she goes back to this. And when you've seen Naples, it's really even more shocking. You know, she goes back down into the old neighborhood. That was hard to understand, too.
My question actually relates to this. So, I felt like I understood the quartet better after or while reading this book, Dreamland, which is about opiate addiction in this country, which is not exactly what I'm talking about. But one of the things they talk about in the book is the mostly young Mexicans who come from this one state. And they don't come to the U.S. because they want to live in the U.S. They come to the U.S. just to make money so they can go home and then have their amazing collection of jeans and their amazing house that's built in the village, and they can become big shot successes at home. And thinking about that in relation to this book, I feel like there is a real desire to go back to your childhood and, in a sense, and to sort of have triumphed over your origins. And I'm curious what your thoughts are with regard to these books, because I think that is one thing that maybe keeps both of them in Naples, keeps them returning, keeps them wanting the same thing, the same man. As we know, Nino, who amazingly hasn't come up, I don't think, this evening yet. Especially in a place like Italy, which is so much smaller than somewhere like the United States, and where escape either has to mean going almost to a whole different world, or maybe it doesn't mean quite the same thing when you can't go as far. So I'd like to hear anything you had to say about that.
I think that is interesting in terms of being sort of like a big fish in a small pond sort of idea, or you leave and you come back and your success story. I can speak from experience that it starts out that way, but then it increasingly feels like this disassociation, like this feeling of having to be a different person when you're there. So my sense of Lenu going back is association or access to Lila, her true love, really.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, this is for Anne. Did you ever find, and how did you resolve it if you did, that as you read in the Italian what was written by Ferrante, you were not able to fully translate into what you felt was her true meaning? I mean, sometimes words, think about a physical ailment, and then you try to describe it to the doctor, and the words that come out really aren't saying what you're experiencing. And I was wondering, as a translator, that must have happened to you at times, and how did you resolve it?
Well, I mean, on the most simple level, sometimes I leave the word in Italian. That's one choice. I mean, obviously it's something you can't do all the time. But or where would we be? Well, yeah. I mean, it's frustrating sometimes. Yes, there's that feeling that you can't get it. I mean, I guess I hope that all those places that I thought I couldn't get, I eventually got, at least in something that's close to what I think that she's saying.
Did you have to go back and forth with the editors to...
Sometimes, yeah. Mm-hmm. Sometimes if there's something I really didn't understand. Yeah. But I mean, I revised many times. So I hope in that process that things get resolved.
How long did it take you to translate a book?
It's really hard to say because of deadlines and other things. But probably 4 or 5 months.
I'm curious about, I know the first book, Troubling Love, L'amore molesto, it's impossible to translate molesto. And how did you?
We had so many back and forths. We practically had a contest for that. I asked everybody I knew. I guess I didn't ask you, actually. What to do about that. I mean, we must have had like 10 versions of it. And then I guess we decided on
what were some of the others? I'm just curious because it's bothered me too. I've been trying to think, how can you get the nuance of molesto, and you cannot.
You can't. I mean, yeah, you can't, because it doesn't mean doesn't mean molested. I mean, it has a connotation, but it doesn't mean that the way if you said molesting love in English, it would seem pretty terrible. I mean, it would sound terrible, but it would also seem like a much worse thing than it's meant to be. It's just a hint. So yeah, that was, I mean, I think we had troubling, troublesome. I don't know, maybe you can think of some of the other ones. But there were a lot.
So when you say revision, you do a lot of revision when you're translating. Is that different when you're doing your own writing?
I don't do my own writing.
You don't do any of your own writing. Okay.
I stay away from it.
Go ahead.
And could you talk to the process that you used when you were translating these novels in terms of the author?
In terms of being in touch with the author?
Yes.
Well, I'm not in
yes.
touch. I actually haven't been in touch with the author at all directly. When I first started, she was the only way, would get in touch with, if I had a question, I would ask the editors in Italy, and they would go to her and ask her the question. And she's a little more, I mean, she's been a little more forthcoming in the sense of doing more interviews in the past few years, I think, and I think I probably could ask her directly, I don't know, maybe. I mean by email, of course. But I've just kept the same relationship with her.
The relationship being
Of going through
always
through
there
somebody
was
else.
the third,
Yes.
there was the editorial, and
Yes.
very interesting. Thank you.
Over here.
You all spoke about, I think, one of the most important themes in the series about suppression and self-suppression. I think a related theme, but in a slightly different vein, is restraint. And I think the relationship between these two women involved a lot of self-restraint, particularly in terms of verbal communication. And all of us as readers often, at least I myself, felt the weight of the emotions of each of them that were never spoken. And I was wondering if you could speak about how you saw that role of restraint, and if you saw that as a sustaining factor in the relationship that without which maybe that friendship would not have lasted in the way that it did.
Interesting question. Got anything? The restraint. The restraint in the friendship
between the two of them.
Well, it's really part of life. I mean, one of the things Ferrari does is tell you everything on the page, so that when Leela asks Lenu to wash her before she gets married, it's a very, very intimate moment. And Lenu is shocked. She's never seen Leela naked before. And she is shocked by her own reaction. She certainly couldn't say to Leela what she's thinking, because it's partly sexual arousal, it's embarrassment, it's fear that she's not as beautiful. I mean, there are all sorts of things that she's feeling. But that plays a part in everyone's life. There's never any relationship in which you can vocalize everything you feel. So that doesn't feel so feel so powerful in the book as the violence does, because that's something where we're all used to restraint. We know that it plays a part in every relationship, but the violence and the shocks that are delivered all the time are more unusual. They're more like melodrama than the restraint.
It's interesting that you used that example, because that scene to me was so human, and so, it's like that alter world that you have in your head. Like if you're, in the balcony at the theater and you're like, what if I jumped? I'm scared I'm going to jump. What if something compels me to jump? The sort of all of these human emotions that go through your mind, but you're not going to say them out loud. And that's just sort of, I think, a very human, in that scene particularly, that she felt all of those things. But I didn't see so much restraint as self-judgment. And I feel like that played a role for Lenu. Like she really had a lot of personal self-judgment, which kind of dictated the ways in which she interacted with Leela. We don't know what Leela felt, because we don't know. But I didn't see so much restraint. You?
No, I didn't see that much restraint, because also she throws this book into the river, and they do terrible things to each other.
But they never speak about it with each other.
Say again?
But they never speak about it with each other.
How terrible they are to each other?
I guess I just meant more in terms of their verbal communication with each other and all of these tremendously emotionally laden events that happen between them, most of which are negative, and they're never verbalized, ever.
Let's see, I'm trying to think of what they say about Nino.
Not so much.
Not so much.
Not so much.
I mean, except when Lanu is with Nino and Leela keeps telling her, you know, you got to get away from him, in one way and another. She does tell her that.
But I don't know. Maybe there's we're used to a very, in your generation. I don't want to be ageist here, but there's a kind of
overshare.
Sharing. Yeah, I was going to say oversharing. A kind of sharing that's just normal and is amplified by social media and posting and sharing, and everybody knows what everyone is thinking. Because you record people, very young people, record it on a moment-to-moment basis, and so when it doesn't sit and stew. It's aerated. And people born in the 40s, they were born in the mid-40s, they were born during the war, so 44, 45, into a culture that for all of its violence is very puritanical. So I just think it's culture more than the two individual women. That's my guess.
Sure, that's good. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you all to unpack Nino a little bit, because when he appears, it's sort of got that romance novel moment almost. He, you know, your heart skips a beat, and then you go, he's like the bad boyfriend, and then he's in and he's out of the text. And so just please unpack that and address Nino as a character, if you will.
He's a bad guy. No, he like everybody else. I mean, he's a complicated person too. I mean, he's a bad boyfriend, and he's not a trustworthy person. But he also wants to get out. So he's driven in a certain sense by the same things that Lanu is. I mean, he wants to be educated. He wants to get out of. I mean, he does go back to Naples, but he goes back to Naples in a completely different way. He becomes a politician. I mean, he also makes his escape, and he does it in kind of a slimy way, but he does. I mean, so there's that part of him that I think is in some way complicating.
I mean, the thing about Nino is, as Judith says, Ferrante refuses to idealize anything. She will not romanticize anything. So she allows us to engage very deeply, but she never says, and they lived happily ever after. We know that is never going to happen. So Nino is sort of held out from the very beginning as a possible exit, as a possible the dream man. He's tall, he's handsome, he's intellectual, he's distant, he's unapproachable, and he leaves first, and he's always a possibility in her life. So we're sort of asked, she dangles Nino in front of us for 4 books. He's deeply unsatisfactory. He's never going to be the hero. But she does that deliberately.
No, if you've never been in love with the handsome, entitled prince, please raise your hand. Didn't think so. So those guys are like that. They have this sense of entitlement that comes from their beauty, that comes from their ease in the world, that comes from their incredible success with women. It's hard to be a success with Leela. That she's tough nut. So he sort of, despite the disabilities of his background, he's just incredible success in the world, and he, that forms his character in a way that more so than the hardship ever did, I think. So it's that the glaze of entitlement, and I don't even blame him for it. I think they need to vaccine for this, like the papillomavirus. Little girls should get this, but until then, no.
I think we have time for one more question.
One thing we haven't talked about yet is politics, and specifically Italian politics and history. And I know that my feeling throughout the books is that not just the politics through which we are living as we experience it through Lenu and Lila, but also the politics that came before, the parents of all these people and where they stood and what had gone down before anybody was born. And I just, there's a lot there that I suspect an Italian readership gets that's harder for us to get, that's not explicitly spelled out in the books. But it seems to me that those forces move in and out, move closer and farther away throughout all four novels, the larger sense of Neapolitan politics, Italian politics, and the politics that happened during and following the Second World War. I just wondered if any of you could talk to that.
Yes, what you say is true. It is there, and it's not explicit. And I mean, you could say that's one of the things that's lost in translation. I mean, you don't want to have a book that's footnoted. I mean, a novel, full of explanations of things, and so there are things that are not that Italians would know. I mean, just the war itself. I mean, Americans just, we don't really. It's not part of our. Wasn't fought here. It's not part of our experience in the same way. And then the factions and the communists against the fascists. I mean, all those things. Yes, they're all there in a way that I think is probably more obvious for an Italian reader. But I don't think that you necessarily need to know all that in order for the books to be. I mean, maybe there's some level that you're not going to get. I guess you have to say that. But I guess as Judith was saying, I mean, it's like the history of feminism. I mean, you don't have to really know the history of Italian feminism in order to, which is slightly different, but in order to get that part of it.
Yes, there's layers. It's a book about militants. It's a book about emotional militants, too. Mm-hmm. And the political militants and the emotional militants are sort of tracks that this narrative runs on. And at the 70s, I lived in Italy in the late 60s and early 70s in this period of incredible violence and turmoil and class warfare and really violent class warfare. And so but I think it's dyed into the fabric of the book in such a way that even if you miss the references, and there are a lot, publications and writers and parties, I still think, just as in the Leopard, which is similar in many ways. So,
thank you.
Judith, you wrote. I pulled this quote because I thought it was so beautiful. Sentimentality is a channel. With Ferrante, there are no channels. It's just the sea.
Well, I was thinking of my mother. The mother-daughter stuff is very personal to me. My mother was very, very sentimental because she was really afraid of feelings. And as sentiment in the narrow channel in a narrow channel, feelings can run safely. They're bordered, and there's no waves, there's no weather, and they're also very shallow. So I think, to me, that she frees you from your mother stuff too, Ferrante, if you read her in the right way. So for me, anyway, it's very personal.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you, Roxana. Thank you, Anne. And thank you all for coming out.
Thank you, Rebecca, for a great moderator.